The small village of St. Mary Mead, nestled amidst the rolling hills of rural England, had been bathed in sunlight all morning. The streets were quiet, save for the distant hum of bees lazily fluttering from one flower to the next, and the occasional clip-clop of a horse-drawn cart making its way along the cobblestone streets. As the clock struck 3, the village, ever so eager for a touch of social delight, was abuzz with activity. The annual St. Mary Mead garden party had begun, a gathering that brought out the best in the townsfolk's sense of decorum, their most elaborate hats, and their most talked-about gossip. Miss Marple, having lived in the village for more years than she cared to count, had long since learned to find amusement in such affairs. Though she had no great love for the socializing itself, she found it far more interesting to observe the subtle nuances of human nature as they played out amidst the teacups and conversation. She couldn't resist the invitation to Mrs. Sylvia, Penhallow's elegant garden. It was a splendid affair, to be sure. The garden was a perfect picture of spring's blessings. Vibrant tulips swayed in the breeze, and delicate daffodils nodded their heads in the sunshine. The air was heavy with the perfume of blooming lilacs, and in the distance, a row of ivy-covered cottages provided a timeless backdrop. The small village seemed almost unreal, a place of dreams, where the scent of freshly cut grass seemed to signal everything in perfect order. The tea table had been set with care. Plates of delicate sandwiches filled with cucumber and smoked salmon, bowls of freshly picked strawberries, and an array of biscuits and cakes that made even the most disciplined dieter pause in their resolve. At the head of the table stood the centerpiece, a beautifully crafted lemon tart, its golden crust gleaming under the sunlight. Mrs. Penhallow, who prided herself on her culinary skills, had assured her guests that the tart would be the highlight of the afternoon. Miss Marple had been content to watch the proceedings unfold, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the gathering. She noted how the village's elite, dressed in their finest dresses and suits, clustered in small groups, each one engaging in the usual village gossip. A group of middle-aged ladies, heads bent together, were exchanging their theories on the recent Bennet's arrival in the village. "I heard they're hiding something," one whispered. "Something that doesn't quite add up." Another, a bit more daring, spoke of the curious circumstances surrounding the death of Mrs. Bennet's first husband. But Miss Marple wasn't concerned with the rumors. She was concerned with the people, their habits, their expressions, the tiniest shifts in their posture that could reveal more than words ever would. The murmur of voices, the clink of china, and the occasional burst of laughter filled the air. But Miss Marple found her thoughts drifting, as they often did, to the complexities of human nature. People she knew were rarely as they appeared. Beneath the surface, there were always secrets, long-buried regrets, and unresolved tensions. Today, she had a peculiar feeling that something was about to unfold, something unexpected, something that would demand her attention. It came, as these things often did, with the sound of a voice piercing the tranquil atmosphere. "Mrs. Penhallow! Mrs. Penhallow!" It was Evelyn Birch, the village's most notorious busybody, her face pale and twisted with distress. Mrs. Penhallow, who had been engaged in a rather animated conversation with Clara Bennet, turned to face Evelyn, her brow furrowing. "Evelyn, whatever is the matter?" "There's a body in the garden." Evelyn's voice wavered, her hand flying to her mouth as though to prevent a scream. The chatter around the table faltered, and a ripple of confusion spread across the guests. The air seemed to grow colder as Miss Marple slowly set down her cup of tea. Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly, but there was no panic in her demeanor. She knew how these things went. A commotion, a bit of hysteria, and then the truth would gradually reveal itself, if one was patient enough to listen. "I'll see." "What's going on?" Miss Marple murmured softly, her voice as calm as ever, and she made her way towards the scene. The other guests, still processing the shock, followed her lead, some more quickly than others. It was just as Evelyn had said. There, near the far corner of Mrs. Penhallow's garden, lying on the soft grass beside a row of rose bushes, was the body of Gregory Haversham. The local solicitor, whom Miss Marple had always found rather disagreeable, lay sprawled in an oddly unnatural pose. His coat was crumpled beneath him, his eyes wide open and staring up at the sky, unblinking in his final frozen surprise. The guests gathered around, gasping in horror, some stepping back, others moving forward in an instinctive attempt to help, though they knew not how. Miss Marple, however, remained composed, her mind already working through the scene with quiet deliberation. She approached the body with a studied calmness, her gaze sweeping over the small pool of blood that had begun to form beneath the solicitor's head. It was a small stain, yet unmistakably red and dark against the green of the grass. "Who found him?" Miss Marple asked, her voice gentle but firm. I did," Evelyn said, her hands trembling. "I was coming to fetch more lemon tarts for the table, and then I saw him. Just like this." "Interesting," Miss Marple murmured, kneeling beside the body. "And I take it no one heard anything unusual? No shouting, no sudden movement?" The group of guests shifted uneasily. "No, not that we noticed," said Mrs. Penhallow, her voice trembling. "Everyone was so engrossed in conversation. We never heard a thing." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind working. There was something strange about the positioning of the body, something that didn't quite make sense. The way his arm was extended outward towards the garden's edge seemed too deliberate. Miss Marple's gaze then turned to the other guests, her sharp eyes taking in each reaction. Evelyn Birch's trembling hands were a telltale sign of her nerves, but there was something else. Something in her manner that was slightly off. She had a tendency to exaggerate, but this seemed too real to be entirely fabricated. The guests were beginning to murmur among themselves, some suggesting the possibility of an accident, others voicing their suspicion that it might have been a sudden medical episode. But Miss Marple knew better. It was never that simple. She stood, her eyes briefly scanning the area around the body. Her attention was momentarily drawn to the edge of the garden, where a perfectly laid-out table stood, with the now unfamiliar lemon tart gleaming in the sunlight. There was something so perfect about it. Too perfect, almost. The tart had not been touched, not a single slice taken. It seemed odd, considering how most of the guests had been nibbling at the other delicacies. And then, as if on cue, Miss Marple's mind clicked. It was not the bloodstain, nor the body that held the key. No, it was something much simpler, much subtler. The lemon tart had been placed at the center of the table, untouched, as if an offering, or perhaps a symbol. As the villagers began to descend into further confusion, Miss Marple stepped back. She let the drama unfold around her, her expression impassive, but in her mind, the pieces of the puzzle were already starting to fall into place. This was no accident. And Gregory Haversham had not simply dropped dead from some mysterious ailment. Someone had meant for him to die today, and that someone was still very much among them. Miss Marple took another moment to consider the scene, allowing the villagers to speculate. She would not rush her observations. No, she would wait. And when the time was right, she would unveil the truth. After all, it was her favorite part of the mystery, the moment when the puzzle's final piece slipped neatly into place. The shock of finding Gregory Haversham's body in the garden lingered over St. Mary Mead like a sudden storm cloud, one that darkened the village's usual tranquility. Miss Marple, with her ever unfathomable composure, stood silently at the edge of the gathering, her hands clasped in front of her. While the others debated theories and expressed their shock, she allowed herself the luxury of observation, letting the noise of the crowd wash over her as she pieced together what little they had seen and heard. The guests, still standing near the body, were in various states of confusion. Evelyn Birch, who had discovered the body, was still clutching her shawl with trembling fingers, her wide eyes darting nervously from one person to another. Mrs. Penhallow, her hostess for the afternoon, was wringing her hands in distress, offering up a litany of polite platitudes in an attempt to regain some semblance of control. The others were equally at a loss. What could they do? They weren't equipped to handle such a tragedy, and their panic was palpable. "The police should be called immediately," Mrs. Penhallow declared, her voice rising above the others. "We must alert the authorities. This is a crime, and we cannot allow it to go unnoticed." "Of course, Mrs. Penhallow," said Inspector Davies, the local constable, who had been called to the scene by a nervous telephone call from one of the guests. A tall man with a somewhat square jaw, his neatly combed hair and pressed uniform, made him look almost comically out of place in such a quiet, rural setting. He arrived, his face a mixture of stoicism and confusion. St. Mary Mead, after all, had rarely been the scene of anything more serious than a missing cat or a squabble. Over a hedgerow. Over a hedgerow. I'm afraid it's more complicated than just a phone call, Mrs. Penhallow, the inspector continued, bending down to take a closer look at the body. We'll need to secure the area, and I'll need to ask everyone here some questions. Please, do not disturb anything. We'll get to the bottom of this. Miss Marple nodded sagely to herself, her attention still fixed on the other villagers. She had no intention of intruding on the inspector's work, but she did notice how the others were reacting to the situation. Everyone seemed to fall into two categories: those who were genuinely unnerved, like Mrs. Penhallow and Evelyn Birch, and those who were eager to offer their opinions, whether or not they had any knowledge to back them up. I think it must have been an accident, Clara Bennet, the younger of the two Bennets who had recently moved to the village, said in a voice that bordered on anxious. She was standing beside her mother, who had remained silent but was fidgeting with her gloves. He was so out of sorts lately. Perhaps he fell. Fell? Evelyn Birch scoffed. Don't be ridiculous, Clara. He wasn't drunk. He was murdered. That's obvious. You can't know that for certain, Evelyn, Mrs. Penhallow interjected, her voice shaky but trying to sound authoritative. We must wait for the police to tell us what happened. But Mrs. Penhallow, Evelyn persisted, it's clear. He was lying there, his body so limp. There's no way. He just fell. She paused for effect, clearly enjoying the attention. He was murdered, and I know it. At this, Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet smile. It was the kind of drama Evelyn excelled at least in her own mind. Evelyn was a self-proclaimed expert in such matters, having read every mystery novel ever written, and though her conclusions were often wild and unsubstantiated, she relished being the center of attention. Yet, there was a certain air of nervousness in her voice, a tremor that betrayed her usual bravado. I'm not so sure, Miss Marple said softly, drawing the attention of a few of the villagers. You see, if one were to fall, there would be a certain way in which the body would land, perhaps twisted at the waist or with a certain kind of unnatural angle to the limbs. Mr. Haversham's posture, however, is different. She paused, her gaze lingering on the still figure of the solicitor. It's almost as though he were carefully placed there. The words hung in the air, and the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Miss Marple didn't seem to notice. She turned away from the body, her mind already working through the various possibilities. It was clear that no one knew much about the man's life outside of his role as the village solicitor, and there were many unanswered questions. Why had he been in Mrs. Penhallow's garden at all, and why now? Miss Marple, do you really think someone could have done this? Clara asked, her voice shaking. Miss Marple met her gaze, her eyes warm but sharp. My dear, people do strange things for strange reasons. No one is ever as they seem. The question is not whether he was murdered, but rather who was responsible. And perhaps more importantly, why? The words fell like a stone in the quiet. For a moment, the guests exchanged uncertain glances, then returned their attention to the body as though seeking reassurance that Miss Marple's words had no real weight. But it was clear to Miss Marple that they were already beginning to speculate. Some were still in shock, but others had already started piecing together their own versions of events. Gregory wasn't the most liked man, Mrs. Penhallow offered hesitantly. He wasn't a bad man per se, but he had a sharp tongue, and he wasn't above making enemies. He didn't always play nicely with the rest of the village. And there's the Bennets, Evelyn Birch added, her eyes gleaming as though she had stumbled upon something truly scandalous. I hear Gregory had some sort of falling out with them not long before he passed. Perhaps they had a quarrel? Miss Marple's attention shifted briefly to Clara and her mother. The younger woman seemed to shrink slightly under the scrutiny of the others, but Mrs. Bennet maintained an air of stoic indifference. Miss Marple noted that the older woman's eyes were narrowed, and her lips were pressed into a thin line. She hadn't spoken a word since the body was discovered, but the weight of her silence was telling. Oh, don't be so dramatic, Evelyn, Clara said, trying to sound composed but failing miserably. Just because Mr. Haversham had a bit of a sharp edge to him doesn't mean he deserved this. She shuddered visibly. We had nothing to do with it. "I'm sure you didn't, dear," Miss Marple said gently, her voice placating. "But we must all consider the possibility that there are things in life we don't know about, things hidden beneath the surface." The conversation turned to speculation. Was there a motive? A grievance? Or was this a random act? Miss Marple kept her silence, observing each person closely, watching for the smallest flicker of a reaction, a shift in the eyes, a nervous cough. She was not ready to reveal what she knew, or rather what she suspected. That would come later. For now, her focus remained fixed on the subtle clues hidden in the words, gestures, and expressions of the villagers. Inspector Davies, after what seemed like an eternity, finally stepped forward, his voice commanding as he addressed the crowd. "I know you're all very distressed by this, but I need to ask each of you some questions. For now, please remain here. I'll get to the bottom of this." Miss Marple, with a gentle nod, made her way to the periphery of the group, her mind already turning over the events of the afternoon. She had seen enough to know that the murder of Gregory Haversham was not a random act, but a carefully orchestrated plan. The timing, the setting, and the victim, everything pointed to a motive hidden deep within the folds of village life. There was much to uncover, and Miss Marple was certain she was the only one who could see it all. The mystery was only just beginning. The village of St. Mary Mead was no stranger to the occasional odd event, but the murder of Gregory Haversham had cast a long shadow over its peaceful streets. For the past 2 days, the garden party incident had consumed the villagers' thoughts. Whispers filled the air at the market, in the churchyard, and at the post office, each person more eager than the last to share their theory, their suspicions, or their gossip. Yet amidst all the speculation, one figure remained oddly detached. From the growing frenzy, Miss Marple. She had always been an observer, and this situation was no different. While the villagers pored over their imaginations, she focused on the facts, the subtle movements, the small details that others missed. The investigation had begun in earnest, with Inspector Davies doing his best to maintain order in a village that was hardly prepared for such an event. He had already interviewed the principal witnesses, Evelyn Birch, who had found the body, and Mrs. Penhallow, whose garden had been the scene of the crime. Neither had much more to offer than vague observations, though both had offered their own theories. But there was something about their accounts, Miss Marple noted, that did not sit quite right. Evelyn was too eager, too convinced, while Mrs. Penhallow seemed more concerned with maintaining appearances than offering useful information. As for the others, their opinions ranged from misguided to outright speculative. It was late afternoon on the 3rd day since the discovery, and Miss Marple had decided to take a more active role in the investigation. She had spent the morning speaking with a few of the villagers who might know more about Gregory Haversham's life, piecing together bits of his character, his business dealings, and his relationships. His death, she believed, was no simple act of violence. It was a calculated decision, the result of some long-standing conflict, hidden beneath layers of politeness and decorum. The most prominent source of information had been the local pub, the White Horse. It was where many of the village's men gathered after work, where secrets were spilled along with ale. The barman, a stocky fellow named John, was more than willing to share his thoughts on Gregory. "Never much liked the fellow," John had said as Miss Marple sipped her tea. Sharp-tongued he was, always quick with a comment that rubbed people the wrong way. Thought he was better than most, if you ask me. "Better than most?" Miss Marple repeated, her voice soft and inquiring. "Aye," John continued, wiping down a glass absent-mindedly. "He wasn't from around here. Came from the city, didn't he? Thought he could do better than the rest of us, bring his fancy solicitor ways to our little village. But the locals didn't take kindly to it. They saw right through him." "What about his business dealings? Anything unusual?" Miss Marple asked. John hesitated before answering. "Well, now that you mention it, I heard tell that he had a bit of a falling out with the Bennets. Not just a small argument either. I think it was something serious. But as for the details, who can say?" The Bennets again. The mention of their name piqued Miss Marple's interest. The Bennets had been relatively new to the village, having arrived only a few months ago, but they had already made an impression. Mrs. Bennet, Clara's mother, had a stern demeanor, and her silence since Gregory's death had not gone unnoticed. Clara, though quieter than her mother, seemed to be harboring her own concerns. There was something about their aloofness that Miss Marple couldn't quite shake. They were hiding something, she was certain of it. Miss Marple spent the next hour speaking with others who might have known Gregory, including some of the tradesmen who had worked for him. The solicitor's affairs were never far from the minds of the locals, and Miss Marple had no difficulty gathering a picture of a man who was both respected and resented in equal measure. He had been involved in several property disputes, and there had been talk of him pressuring a few of the village's elderly residents into selling land they did not want to part with. His dealings had not always been above board, and the whispers of shady practices seemed to be growing louder. By the time she returned to Mrs. Penhallow's house, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the garden. It was the perfect time to visit, when most of the guests and the police would be gone for the evening, and the house was quiet. Miss Marple had already decided that her next step would be to revisit the scene of the crime. The clues, she felt, were there, just waiting to be uncovered. The garden was, as expected, empty. The body had been removed days ago, and though the bloodstain had long since been washed away, Miss Marple's keen eyes still found remnants of the scene. She took a slow, deliberate walk around the area, her fingers brushing lightly against the rose bushes that had been so close to the site of the murder. As she moved along the path, her eyes fell on a small patch of disturbed earth near the edge of the garden. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make her stop. She crouched down, examining the ground closely. A single footprint was visible in the loose soil. It wasn't large or particularly deep, but it was there, and it hadn't been noticed before. Miss Marple's mind clicked. Someone had stood here. Someone had lingered. And whoever it was had been careful not to leave too many traces behind. Carefully, Miss Marple stood and moved on. Her thoughts were already running ahead of her. Where had the person gone next? What had they done after the crime? The placement of the body had been far too calculated for this to have been a simple attack. The person had been deliberate, methodical. But why leave the scene so quickly? What had driven them to act before the guests could even notice? As Miss Marple continued her quiet walk, she reflected on her conversation with John the barman. It seemed clear that Gregory had made enemies, but the question remained: who among them had been driven to murder? And why had they chosen such a dramatic moment, in front of so many witnesses, to strike? By the time she made her way back to the house, she had formed a theory, though one she was not yet ready to share with anyone. There was a thread running through it all, a thread that connected Gregory's strained relationship with the Bennets, his business dealings, and the way in which his death had played out. But Miss Marple was patient. There was no rush. She would take her time. Every piece of the puzzle was important, and she was certain the answer was hidden within the folds of ordinary village life. That evening, as Miss Marple sat alone in her cozy parlor, sipping her tea, she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The mystery of Gregory Haversham's death was far from over, but she could feel the solution drawing near. The final pieces were falling into place, slowly, steadily, like the ticking of an old clock. Tomorrow she would speak with Clara and her mother. Perhaps they would offer her the last clue she needed to unravel the truth. But Miss Marple knew that, for now, patience was her greatest ally. After all, the most carefully laid plans were often the most fragile. And in her experience, the truth had a way of revealing itself when it was least expected. The morning of the 4th day since Gregory Haversham's death brought with it a heavy fog, cloaking St. Mary Mead in a veil of silence. The village, which had always seemed so vibrant under the sun, now felt somber and distant, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. Miss Marple, however, was unfazed by the mist that hung in the air, her mind clear and focused. She had been gathering information for days, allowing the various pieces of the puzzle to slowly fall into place. There was still much to uncover, but she had a nagging sense that the time was nearing when the truth would reveal itself. The previous day's visit to Mrs. Penhallow's garden had provided some answers, though none were definitive. The small footprint near the scene had been a crucial clue, but there was not enough evidence to identify the person who had left it. The disturbed earth, however, had made one thing clear. The murderer had not been in a rush to flee. Whoever had committed the crime had lingered in the garden, perhaps even watching as the guests continued their socializing, blissfully unaware of the horror that had taken place only a few yards away. The deliberate nature of the act suggested that the killer had been familiar with the village, with the people, and with the setting. This was not a crime of passion. It was a carefully planned murder. Today, Miss Marple had decided to turn her attention to the Bennets. The mention of their name in connection with Gregory Haversham's falling out had stuck in her mind. The Bennets had been in St. Mary Mead for only a short time, yet they had already managed to leave a strong impression. Clara, the younger of the two, had seemed nervous during the initial interviews, but it was her mother, Mrs. Bennet, who piqued Miss Marple's interest. The older woman had kept herself distant, almost cold, since the discovery of Gregory's body. Her silence was telling. She was hiding something. Miss Marple's first stop was the Bennet household, a large stone cottage on the edge of the village. The house had an air of aloofness about it, its windows curtained tightly against the morning light. Miss Marple rang the doorbell, and after a moment Clara appeared, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes were red, as though she had been crying, but she quickly composed herself when she saw who was standing on the doorstep. "Miss Marple," Clara said softly, stepping aside to let the older woman in. "I wasn't expecting you." "I know it's an inconvenient time, my dear," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle, "but I've been meaning to speak with you and your mother. There are a few matters I'd like to discuss. Nothing too alarming, I assure you." Clara led Miss Marple into a sitting room, its furniture simple and unremarkable, but its atmosphere heavy with an unspoken tension. The room smelled faintly of lavender and something else, something cold, almost distant. It was the smell of a house that had not yet fully settled into the rhythms of village life. Miss Marple had learned long ago that a home could tell as much about a person as their words or actions. "Mother is in the garden," Clara said, her voice hesitant. "She spends a lot of time there these days." Miss Marple nodded knowingly. "Perhaps we can join her." They stepped out into the garden, where Mrs. Bennet was standing by a well-kept hedge, pruning a rosebush with a precision that seemed almost mechanical. Her back was straight, her movements sharp, and there was something about her stillness that sent a shiver through Miss Marple. This was not a woman at peace with the world. She was a woman who was hiding something, and Miss Marple knew that it was only a matter of time before the truth would surface. "Mrs. Bennet," Miss Marple said gently, stepping forward, "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Mrs. Bennet turned slowly, her expression unreadable. "Miss Marple," she replied, her voice cool but polite. "What brings you here?" "I wanted to speak with you about the recent events in the village," Miss Marple said, her tone nonchalant. "About Mr. Haversham's death." At the mention of Gregory's name, Clara stiffened beside Miss Marple, her fingers tightening around the edge of her shawl. Mrs. Bennet's face remained unchanged, though Miss Marple could see the faintest flicker of something, guilt, anxiety, pass across her eyes. "Mr. Haversham," Mrs. Bennet said, her tone flat. "What about him?" "I've heard that you and Mr. Haversham had some disagreements," Miss Marple said, her voice calm, almost conversational. "Is that true?" There was a brief pause before Mrs. Bennet answered. "We did have some business dealings. Nothing worth discussing, really. Mr. Haversham was a solicitor, and he handled a few legal matters for us when we first moved here. But that's all." "Nothing more?" Miss Marple asked, her eyes sharp. "I've heard some rumors about a falling out. Between you and Mr. Haversham? Is it possible that there was more to your relationship than you're letting on?" Mrs. Bennet's hand tightened on the pruning shears, but her voice remained steady. "I don't know what rumors you've heard, Miss Marple, but I can assure you there was no conflict. Mr. Haversham was simply doing his job, nothing more." Miss Marple studied Mrs. Bennet for a moment, noting the slight quiver in her hands. She was lying, and Miss Marple knew it. But why? What had happened between the Bennets and Gregory that had caused such tension? The details were still elusive, but Miss Marple was determined to find out. She turned her gaze to Clara, who was now standing behind her mother, her eyes fixed on the ground. "Clara, dear," Miss Marple said kindly, "perhaps you can help. Me understand. You've spent some time with Mr. Haversham, haven't you?" Clara looked up, her face pale. I don't know what you mean," she stammered, avoiding Miss Marple's gaze. "I understand it's a difficult time for you. Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle but probing. "But if there's anything you can tell me about Mr. Havisham, anything at all, it could help us understand what happened." Clara shifted uncomfortably, her eyes flickering to her mother before returning to Miss Marple. She opened her mouth as though to speak, but no words came. The silence stretched, and Miss Marple could see the internal struggle playing out in Clara's eyes. There was something she knew, something she wasn't saying. After what seemed like an eternity, Clara spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Havisham. He wasn't the man he seemed to be. He had plans for things that shouldn't have been his concern. He wanted to take things from us, things that didn't belong to him." Miss Marple's interest piqued, but she didn't push Clara further. There was more to this story, and Miss Marple knew that she would have to be patient. But it was clear now, the Bennets were not as innocent as they had appeared. They were entangled in Gregory Havisham's death in some way, whether directly or indirectly. Miss Marple wasn't yet certain. As she took her leave from the Bennet household, Miss Marple's mind was abuzz with possibilities. The Bennets had something to hide, but what? And how did Gregory's death fit into their carefully constructed lives? She could feel the pieces of the puzzle falling into place one by one. But there was still much left to uncover, and Miss Marple would not rest until she had all the answers. The first suspects had been revealed, but the true culprit was still hidden in the shadows. The fog of uncertainty had not yet lifted in St. Mary Mead, and as the days stretched on, the village's once peaceful rhythm seemed to pulse with tension. Miss Marple's quiet investigation was uncovering more than she had anticipated, but each new clue only led to more questions. Gregory Havisham's death had stirred up something dark in the heart of the village, and as she delved deeper, she realized that the villagers' seemingly placid lives were far more complicated than they appeared. The Bennets had been the focal point of Miss Marple's suspicions. Clara's reluctant admission about Gregory's business dealings with them had hinted at a deeper issue, though Miss Marple had yet to uncover the full extent of their involvement. But there was something else that had caught her attention during her last visit to the Bennet household, a faint trace of unease in Clara's behavior, a momentary hesitation in Mrs. Bennet's words. They were not as innocent as they wished to appear. Yet Miss Marple knew there was more to the story, and her mind lingered on the idea of hidden motives. It was on the morning of the 5th day since Gregory's death when Miss Marple made her way back to the village square. The air was still heavy with mist, and the cobblestone streets were quiet, the usual bustle of morning activity muffled by the low-hanging fog. Miss Marple's steps were slow, deliberate, as she walked past the familiar landmarks of St. Mary Mead, the small bakery, the butcher's shop, the old fountain in the square. It was here, amid the humdrum of daily life, that she felt the puzzle she was piecing together might finally start to make sense. Her first stop was at the post office, where she knew the village's elderly residents often gathered for their daily chat. Mrs. Gray, a widow who had lived in St. Mary Mead for decades, was one of Miss Marple's trusted informants. Mrs. Gray had an eye for detail and a memory like a steel trap. If anyone knew something about Gregory Havisham's dealings in the village, it would be her. "Miss Marple!" Mrs. Gray called out cheerfully as Miss Marple entered. "Come for your usual gossip, have you?" "Not today, Mrs. Gray," Miss Marple replied, her tone light but purposeful. "I'm afraid I'm looking for something a bit more specific." Mrs. Gray raised an eyebrow. "Oh? And what might that be?" "I'm hoping you can help me recall anything about Mr. Havisham, anything unusual that might have happened in the past few months. He wasn't exactly popular around here, was he?" Mrs. Gray leaned forward, lowering her voice as though she were about to impart a great secret. "Oh, Miss Marple, you're right about that. Mr. Havisham was a man who knew how to make enemies. He had a way of getting under people's skin, especially when it came to money. You see, a few months ago, he started pressing the elder folk in the village to sell their land, at prices that were, well, far below what it was worth. He said he was helping them by buying their land, but I heard whispers that he was taking advantage of their poor health, their need for cash. It didn't sit right with a lot of people." Miss Marple's interest piqued. "Did anyone refuse him?" Mrs. Gray nodded. "Oh, plenty of them did, but not all. Some of the older folk were desperate. Mrs. Crawley, for one, sold him part of her property. It's that little stretch of land by the river. And did you hear anything about the Bennets? Miss Marple pressed, watching for any reaction. At the mention of the Bennets, Mrs. Gray's face tightened. Ah, the Bennets. They've been in the thick of it, too. Not as directly involved with Mr. Haversham's dealings, but there were rumors of disagreements between them. Mrs. Bennet always seemed like she had something to hide. You could see it in the way she carried herself, the way she'd speak in those clipped tones of hers. I don't trust her, nor her daughter. Miss Marple paused, her eyes narrowing as she considered Mrs. Gray's words. The Bennets were involved, but how? She needed to know more. The connection between the Bennets and Gregory was becoming clearer, but the final piece was still missing. Thank you, Mrs. Gray, Miss Marple said, her voice warm but thoughtful. You've given me quite a bit to think about. As Miss Marple made her way out of the post office, she felt the weight of the clues beginning to accumulate in her mind. The land deals, the tensions between Gregory and the Bennets, the whispers of something shady in the air, it all pointed in a certain direction. But there was still something elusive about the case. Gregory's death had been too carefully planned, too precise, for it to be the result of a simple dispute over land. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple returned to Mrs. Penhallow's house. She had spent the morning gathering information, but there was one more place she needed to visit, the scene of the crime. The garden, though now quiet and untouched, still held the remnants of that fateful day. Miss Marple had already examined it once, but something in the back of her mind urged her to return. There was a detail she had missed, something small but potentially vital. As she entered the garden, her eyes scanned the familiar surroundings. The same rose bushes, the same well-kept flower beds. The sun was now high in the sky, and the garden seemed peaceful, almost idyllic. Yet, beneath the surface, Miss Marple could sense the tension still lingering in the air. She moved slowly, methodically, her fingers brushing against the foliage as she retraced her steps from days earlier. It was then that her eyes landed on something she hadn't noticed before, a small, half-hidden object near the foot of the rose bush. Miss Marple bent down, her fingers brushing against the earth. There, partly buried in the soil, was a small silver button. It was tarnished, but unmistakably shiny in the afternoon light. Miss Marple picked it up carefully, turning it over in her hand. It was a button, likely from a coat, and it seemed out of place in such a setting. For a moment, Miss Marple stood there, considering the button. It was small, insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but something about it resonated with her. This was no ordinary piece of fabric. This button had been dropped deliberately. It had been left behind, perhaps in haste, by someone who had been close to the scene. Miss Marple's mind raced as she turned the button over again. It was simple, unremarkable, except for the faint engraving on its back. She squinted, her eyes narrowing as she made out the letters, G.H. Gregory Haversham's initials. The realization struck her like a thunderclap. This button, belonging to Gregory's coat, had been torn off during the struggle. He had been close to his assailant when the final blow had been struck. But who had been close enough to him to tear his coat, and why had they left this small clue behind? It was a piece of the puzzle she had been waiting for. She now had a tangible connection between Gregory and his killer, a link that was far more personal than she had expected. The game was shifting, the stakes growing higher with each new discovery. But Miss Marple was ready. The truth was within reach. She slipped the button into her pocket and turned back toward the house, her thoughts whirring as she considered her next steps. The mystery was unraveling, but Miss Marple knew it would take one final twist to bring everything together. And when that twist came, she would be ready. The days continued to stretch on in St. Mary Mead, the lingering fog now lifting to reveal the sun, though the air still felt heavy with the weight of unspoken secrets. The village, which had once seemed like an idyllic haven, now seemed full of cracks waiting to be discovered. Miss Marple's investigation was unraveling the mysteries beneath the surface, yet each new discovery only led to more questions. The button she had found in Mrs. Penhallow's garden, engraved with Gregory Haversham's initials, had been an important clue, one that tied the solicitor to his killer. But it was not enough to reveal the full story. She needed more, and she knew exactly where to go to find it. The Bennets had remained at the heart of Miss Marple's suspicions. Mrs. Bennet's cold demeanor, Clara's reluctance to speak, and the growing tension between them and Gregory pointed toward a motive. Gregory's attempts to pressure the elderly into selling their land had caused many to turn against him. But the Bennet family had been involved in a way that Miss Marple could not yet fully understand. It was time to confront them. Quietly, methodically, and without causing undue alarm. It was mid-afternoon when Miss Marple made her way to the Bennet household once again. This time her purpose was clearer. She would speak directly to Clara and her mother, with no distractions and no more half-truths. She needed to press for the details that would unlock the last remaining secrets of this case. As she arrived at the door, it was Clara who greeted her once again. This time she appeared more composed, but her eyes still held the same nervousness, the same hesitation that Miss Marple had noticed before. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," Clara said, her voice polite but strained. "I wasn't expecting you today. I hope everything is all right." "I'm sure everything is fine, dear," Miss Marple replied, offering her a warm smile. "But I do need to speak with you and your mother once more. There are a few things I believe we need to clear up." Clara looked away, her gaze flicking toward the door to the sitting room, as if considering whether to allow Miss Marple inside. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded and stepped aside. "Please, come in. I'll fetch Mother." The house seemed quieter today, the usual hum of domestic life absent. As Miss Marple entered, her eyes scanned the room, noting the stiff, almost uncomfortable atmosphere. Mrs. Bennet was sitting in a chair near the fireplace, her hands folded in her lap, her face a mask of politeness. She looked every bit the stoic matron Miss Marple had come to expect. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Bennet said, her voice cool but cordial, "what brings you here today?" "I trust I'm not disturbing you, Mrs. Bennet," Miss Marple began, her tone soft but deliberate. "I simply need to ask you and Clara about Mr. Haversham's death. There are some things that don't quite add up, and I believe it's time we cleared the air." Clara shifted uncomfortably on her feet, but Mrs. Bennet's expression remained unchanged. Miss Marple was certain that beneath that calm exterior, Mrs. Bennet was hiding something important, something that had to do with Gregory Haversham. "I'm not sure what you mean, Miss Marple," Mrs. Bennet said, her voice steady, though there was a slight tightness around her mouth that suggested otherwise. "Gregory Haversham's death is a tragedy, of course, but I don't see what we could possibly add to your investigation." Miss Marple studied Mrs. Bennet for a long moment, her sharp eyes noting the subtle shift in her posture, the way her fingers tightened slightly on the arms of the chair. She had seen it before, the telltale signs of someone holding something back. "Mrs. Bennet, I believe you know more than you're letting on," Miss Marple said gently, her words calculated. "You and Gregory had a disagreement, didn't you? A serious one. About the land he wanted you to sell." Mrs. Bennet's eyes flickered, and for a brief second, Clara's gaze darted to her mother, as if silently pleading for her to say nothing. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, until Mrs. Bennet spoke again, her voice low and guarded. "It's true that we had some business dealings with Gregory," she said slowly, "but I don't see how that has anything to do with his death. We disagreed on some matters, yes, but that's all. He was a solicitor, and his job was to represent our interests. If you're suggesting that I'm not suggesting anything, Mrs. Bennet," Miss Marple interrupted softly, her voice calm but insistent. "But I do believe you're hiding something. And I'm not the only one who feels that way. There are people in this village who have seen your behavior, heard your words, and they've come to their own conclusions." Clara's eyes widened at this, and Miss Marple could see her trying to hold herself together, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed her. Miss Marple's gaze softened slightly, but she wasn't about to back down. She could feel the truth slipping ever so close, just out of reach. "Perhaps you should tell me everything, Mrs. Bennet," Miss Marple continued. "It might be difficult, but I assure you it's the only way to clear the air. Gregory's death wasn't an accident. It was planned, and someone in this household was involved." There was a long pause. Mrs. Bennet's face remained impassive, but Miss Marple could see the faintest tremor in her hand. Finally, Mrs. Bennet stood, her back stiff, her eyes narrowing. "I don't know what you think you've uncovered, Miss Marple," she said in a tone that was now sharp and defensive. "But you are mistaken. We have no further involvement in Gregory's death than anyone else in this village." Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "And yet you haven't told me everything, have you? You knew Mr. Haversham was pressing people to sell their land. He was trying to force the elderly to part with their property, and you were one of those who resisted. But that's not the whole story, is it?" Mrs. Bennet's eyes flickered once more, and this time Clara's breath caught. Miss Marple saw it, and she seized the moment. "There's something you're not telling me, Mrs. Bennet," Miss Marple said softly. "Something you didn't want anyone to know. Something that might just explain why Gregory's death happened when it did." Clara finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper, as if the words were being torn from her. "It's true," she said, her voice trembling. We were desperate. Gregory had threatened us. He was going to take everything from us if we didn't agree to sell." Miss Marple's eyes softened with understanding, though she still kept her composure. "What kind of threat, Clara?" "We didn't have a choice," Clara continued, tears welling up in her eyes. "We didn't want to lose everything. But he said if we didn't sell, he'd make sure we'd regret it. He had leverage. He knew things about us. Things we couldn't afford to have exposed." The air in the room seemed to grow thicker with each passing second. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. The motive was there, buried beneath fear and desperation. Miss Marple allowed a quiet moment of reflection before speaking again. "And what happened after that, Clara? Did your mother—" "I don't want to talk about it anymore," Mrs. Bennet interjected sharply, her voice rising in anger. "I won't discuss it." But Miss Marple could see the cracks in the woman's resolve. She had come close to the truth, and there was no turning back now. The story was unfolding, and soon it would all make sense. "I believe you've told me everything I need to know, Mrs. Bennet," Miss Marple said quietly, her tone unwavering. "Now, I'll leave you to your thoughts. But remember this. The truth always finds its way to the surface. It's just a matter of time." As Miss Marple turned to leave, she knew the final pieces of the puzzle were within reach. The quiet village of St. Mary Mead was beginning to show signs of change. The once serene streets now felt heavy with anticipation, as if the very cobblestones beneath the villagers' feet had absorbed the tensions of the past week. Gregory Haversham's death had turned the familiar rhythms of daily life upside down, and though Miss Marple had made great strides in her investigation, she could not shake the feeling that something was still hidden, something just beyond her grasp. She had spoken with Mrs. Bennet and Clara again, and although much had been revealed, the final piece of the puzzle still eluded her. The threats Gregory had made, the fear in Clara's voice, and the unspoken secrets Mrs. Bennet had guarded so carefully, all of it painted a picture of desperation, but it was still not enough to explain why Gregory had to die. There was something more, something deeper than a business dispute over land, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover it. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to Mrs. Penhallow's house. The scene of the crime, though still fresh in her mind, was not what she wanted to revisit. Instead, she was drawn to the memory of the other guests, the people who had been at the garden party that fateful afternoon, the people who might have seen something, said something, or perhaps more importantly, been involved in something they shouldn't have been. The more Miss Marple thought about it, the clearer it became. One of the guests had to know more than they were letting on. When she arrived, Mrs. Penhallow greeted her with a smile that seemed to falter as soon as she saw the determination in Miss Marple's eyes. "Miss Marple, how good to see you again," Mrs. Penhallow said, her voice light but betraying a hint of concern. "I do hope you're not here to trouble me with more questions. It's been such a difficult time for all of us." "Not at all, Mrs. Penhallow," Miss Marple replied, her tone soothing. "I'm merely following up on some details. You see, I've been thinking more about the garden party, and I believe there are still some things I need to understand. I'd like to speak with some of the other guests again, if I may." Mrs. Penhallow hesitated, then nodded. "Of course, Miss Marple. It's the least I can do after all you've done for us. But if you don't mind me asking, who exactly are you planning to speak with?" "I'd like to begin with Evelyn." "Birch?" Miss Marple said, her eyes narrowing slightly. Her reaction to Mr. Haversham's body seemed a bit too quick. She was the one who found him, and though she claimed to have been horrified, I can't help but wonder if there's more to it. Evelyn. Mrs. Penhallow's expression darkened. I suppose that makes sense. She was certainly dramatic about it all. But I can't say I would be surprised if there's more going on than she lets on. Evelyn has always had a flair for the theatrical, though she's not the most reliable source of information. Still, you may be right. Miss Marple thanked her and left the sitting room, her mind already turning over the next steps. Evelyn. Birch was, indeed, an interesting character. Known for her gossip and dramatic flair, she had been the first to cry out when she discovered Gregory's body in the garden. But there had been something about her reaction, too quick, too theatrical, that had made Miss Marple suspicious. People like Evelyn often hid their true feelings behind a veil of exaggeration, and Miss Marple was certain there was more beneath her outward distress than met the eye. The house where Evelyn Birch lived was on the edge of the village, a small but tidy cottage with ivy crawling up its stone walls. As Miss Marple approached, she could hear the faint sound of birdsong and the rustle of wind through the trees, but there was an odd stillness to the air, as though even nature was holding its breath. Evelyn opened the door quickly, almost too. Quickly, her face flushed and a little too bright. "Miss Marple!" Evelyn exclaimed, her voice higher-pitched than usual. "What a surprise! I wasn't expecting anyone today." "I do hope I'm not disturbing you, Evelyn," Miss Marple said, her voice calm and measured. "But I've come to ask you a few questions. It's about the afternoon of the garden party, you know. I've been thinking about your discovery of Mr. Haversham's body, and I'd like to hear more about it." Evelyn's smile faltered, and for the briefest moment, Miss Marple caught a flicker of something. Fear, perhaps? Guilt? It passed so quickly that she wasn't sure it had been there at all. Evelyn stepped aside, motioning for Miss Marple to enter. Of course, Evelyn said, trying to sound casual but failing to mask the edge of nervousness in her voice. "I suppose you want to know how I found him. It was a dreadful shock, you know. I was just coming to fetch more tarts for the table when I saw him there, just lying there." Miss Marple listened patiently, but she noticed that Evelyn's hands were trembling, and her words were coming out in a rush. It was clear to Miss Marple that Evelyn was hiding something. She had been the first to discover the body, yet her reaction seemed more centered on drawing attention to herself than offering any real insight into what had happened. "Evelyn, I must ask," Miss Marple interjected gently. "When you found Mr. Haversham, were you alone? Did anyone else see you?" Evelyn's eyes widened, and for a moment she hesitated before answering. I'm sure I was alone. But then, of course, the others came running when I screamed. I don't know who could have seen me before that, though." "And what of Mr. Haversham's coat?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft but probing. "I noticed that he was dressed rather neatly, yet his coat seemed to have been torn slightly, as though someone had pulled at it. Do you recall anything unusual about his appearance?" Evelyn's face paled at the mention of the torn coat, and Miss Marple's gaze did not miss the way her hand clenched tightly around the edge of her shawl. "I didn't notice anything like that," Evelyn said, her voice wavering slightly. I was too upset to pay attention to details. I just saw him there, and I was horrified." Miss Marple nodded, her expression neutral, but inside, her mind was racing. The torn coat, the way Evelyn had reacted. She could feel the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Something had happened between Evelyn and Gregory, something that had been concealed behind a veil of shock and drama. But what? Miss Marple knew she needed to press Evelyn further, but she also knew that it would take time. The truth was slowly unfolding, but it was still buried beneath layers of fear, guilt, and carefully constructed lies. "I appreciate your honesty, Evelyn," Miss Marple said, rising from her chair. "But I think we'll need to speak again soon. There's still much to uncover." As Miss Marple left Evelyn's cottage, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was nearing the heart of the mystery. Every step she took, every conversation she had, brought her closer to the truth. But with each new revelation, the story became more complicated, the motives more tangled. Gregory Haversham's death had been a carefully orchestrated event, one that involved more than just business disputes and land deals. There were personal secrets at play, secrets that would soon come to light. And when they did, the truth would be revealed. But Miss Marple wasn't finished yet. The final twist was still to come. The days seemed to blur together now. Each conversation Miss Marple had, each clue she uncovered, seemed to bring her closer to an inevitable confrontation. The pieces of Gregory Haversham's death were scattered across the village like shards of glass, each jagged, each important. But only when placed together would they form a clear picture. Miss Marple's mind raced as she walked through the village, her thoughts constantly circling back to one person, one question: who had truly killed Gregory Haversham, and why? It had become clear to Miss Marple that Gregory's death was not simply a matter of business rivalry or personal grievances. While his land dealings had played a significant role in sowing discord among some of the village's older residents, there was something deeper at play, something hidden beneath layers of deceit, fear, and unresolved tension. Mrs. Bennet and Clara, though they had provided valuable information, were still hiding something they weren't prepared to reveal. Evelyn Birch, too, had been more involved than she had first let on. And the more Miss Marple thought about it, the more she was convinced that the key to solving the case lay in the interactions between these individuals, and the small but telling moments when they thought no one was watching. It was late afternoon, when Miss Marple returned to Mrs. Penhallow's house once more, having spent the day revisiting old conversations and piecing together the final fragments of the puzzle. She had gathered enough to know that the end of the investigation was near. All she needed now was one final test. One last piece of the puzzle that would snap everything into place. Mrs. Penhallow greeted Miss Marple at the door with a warm smile, though Miss Marple could tell that the hostess, too, had felt the strain of the past few days. The village had never been this tense, this full of suspicion, and though Mrs. Penhallow was as much a part of the social fabric as anyone, she had remained silent about the details of that afternoon. Her role in the garden party had been that of a gracious host, but Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her involvement than just a hospitable gesture. After all, she had been a witness to the moment when the garden party had turned into a crime scene. "I'm so glad you've come back, Miss Marple," Mrs. Penhallow said as they entered the sitting room, a fire crackling gently in the hearth. "Is there anything I can do to help? You've been so patient with all of us." Miss Marple took a seat, her eyes thoughtful. "I've come to the conclusion, Mrs. Penhallow, that I need to speak to you about something important. It's about the garden party, specifically what happened after Mr. Haversham was found." Mrs. Penhallow shifted in her seat, her expression flickering briefly with surprise before returning to her usual calm demeanor. "What exactly do you mean, Miss Marple?" "You see, Mrs. Penhallow, I believe I've gathered all the pieces of this puzzle," Miss Marple began, her voice soft but firm. "But there's still one detail that eludes me, and I think you may be the one to help me with it." Mrs. Penhallow's brow furrowed slightly, and Miss Marple could sense her unease. "I don't understand," she said. "What do you think I know that I haven't told you?" Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes sharp as she fixed Mrs. Penhallow with a steady gaze. "The key to Gregory Haversham's death is not in the land deals, nor in the squabbles over property. No, it's in the way people behave when they're afraid. When they're caught in a web of lies and guilt, they can't help but reveal themselves in the smallest of ways. And that's where you come in." Mrs. Penhallow's face turned pale, and Miss Marple saw the briefest flicker of discomfort in her eyes. It was a subtle reaction, but one Miss Marple knew well. The tiny shifts in expression, the micro-reactions that betrayed more than words ever could. "I've been thinking," Miss Marple continued, her voice quiet, almost conspiratorial, "about the moment when Evelyn Birch found Mr. Haversham's body. She was the first to cry out, the first to draw attention to the murder. But what if that wasn't an accident? What if she was the one who needed to be seen, to be the center of attention in that moment? After all, Evelyn is known for her dramatic flair." Mrs. Penhallow's lips pressed into a thin line, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Miss Marple didn't miss the gesture. "You see," Miss Marple went on, her tone still soft but unwavering, "Evelyn has been hiding something, just as Mrs. Bennet and Clara have. But you, Mrs. Penhallow, have been in the background, watching it all unfold. You've seen the way these people interact, the subtle exchanges of looks and words. You've been close enough to see what they don't want you to see. Mrs. Penhallow's face was now a mixture of fear and frustration. I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple, she said, her voice low, though there was a tremor in her words. Oh, I think you do, Miss Marple replied gently, her gaze unwavering. You see, I've been piecing this together for days. You've seen the way Mr. Haversham was trying to manipulate people, pressuring them into selling their land. He was not a man who would let go of something he wanted, not without a fight. But you also saw something else, something that made you realize just how dangerous he could be. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, watching as Mrs. Penhallow's expression shifted, the weight of her thoughts clearly heavy on her mind. The truth is, Miss Marple said softly, you knew that Gregory Haversham had become a threat to the very people you cared about. You knew that if he wasn't stopped, he would destroy them. And so, you made a choice. Mrs. Penhallow's eyes met Miss Marple's, and for a long moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was thick with unspoken understanding. Miss Marple, I never wanted it to come to this, Mrs. Penhallow whispered, her voice barely audible. But you're right. I knew something had to be done. I couldn't let Gregory ruin the lives of those I care about. He had taken everything. His threats, his manipulation. I did what I had to do. Miss Marple remained silent for a moment, allowing the gravity of Mrs. Penhallow's words to settle. The truth was finally coming to light, but Miss Marple knew that the answers were still incomplete. There was still more to the story, more threads to untangle before the final piece could be placed. I know you did what you thought was right, Miss Marple said softly. But there's one thing I still don't understand, Mrs. Penhallow. How did you know it would be Evelyn who found him? How did you plan it so that she would be the one to discover the body? The one to bring attention to the crime? Mrs. Penhallow looked away, her face flushed with guilt. Evelyn. She was always so eager to make a scene. She loved being the center of attention. She was the perfect choice. I knew she would scream. I knew she would draw everyone to her. It was the perfect alibi. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing. And the button, she added, her voice tinged with curiosity. The button I found in the garden, Mr. Haversham's button. Was that meant to mislead me? To make me think the crime was not as carefully planned as it was? Mrs. Penhallow's face twisted in a mixture of guilt and relief. I couldn't risk leaving it behind. It was a mistake, I admit, but in the chaos of it all, I thought it would go unnoticed. Miss Marple stood up, her mind already turning over the next steps. The pieces were falling into place. Gregory Haversham had been killed not out of simple malice, but out of fear. Fear of a man who threatened to destroy everything. And yet, even in the midst of it all, Miss Marple knew that the true murderer wasn't someone who had acted alone. It had been a web of people, each one tangled in their own lies and fears. And now, the final truth was just within reach. I think, Miss Marple said softly, that we've reached the end of our investigation. And soon, I'll have the full story. The fog that had hung over St. Mary Mead for days had finally lifted, leaving behind a crisp clarity in the air that seemed to mirror Miss Marple's own thoughts. The village had, for the most part, returned to its usual pace. Quiet, serene, and unsuspecting. But behind the tranquil surface, things had shifted. The mystery of Gregory Haversham's death had unraveled in ways Miss Marple had never anticipated, and as she walked through the village streets, her mind was alive with the answers she had pieced together. She had made one final visit to Mrs. Penhallow's house the previous afternoon, where the last critical details of the case had fallen into place. Mrs. Penhallow, having been pushed into a corner by Miss Marple's persistent questioning, had finally confessed to her involvement in the death of Gregory Haversham. But as Miss Marple had suspected, the story was far more complicated than one woman's desperation. The truth about Gregory's murder was tangled in a web of fears, lies, and half-truths, lies that had kept the village in the dark for too long. Now, the time had come to reveal the truth. It was evening when Miss Marple returned to the village square, where several of the key players in the mystery, Mrs. Bennet, Clara, Evelyn Birch, and Mrs. Penhallow had agreed to gather for one final conversation. The air was cool, with just a hint of autumn's approach, and the sun had begun its slow descent beyond the horizon. The village's familiar buildings stood in the soft light, and Miss Marple felt a sense of closure creeping over her as she made her way to the small gathering point near the fountain that had been a part of St. Mary Mead for as long as anyone could remember. Mrs. Penhallow was already there, standing near the fountain, her hands clasped tightly together. Clara and Mrs. Bennet stood a few paces away, both of them looking stiff and uneasy. Evelyn Birch, however, was nowhere to be seen. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, and a sense of foreboding washed over her. Evelyn had been the first to discover Gregory's body, yet now she was absent from the gathering. Why had she not come? "I'm afraid Evelyn is taking longer than expected," Mrs. Penhallow said as Miss Marple approached, her voice soft, but betraying a hint of anxiety. "She said she'd meet us here." "I see," Miss Marple replied, her gaze fixed on the empty space where Evelyn should have been standing. "I'm certain she'll arrive shortly." There was no mistaking the undercurrent of tension between the others. Mrs. Bennet's lips were tightly pressed together, and Clara's gaze kept flickering between Miss Marple and her mother. It was clear that neither of them were eager to speak, though both knew that the end of this mystery was fast approaching. They had all played a part, whether knowingly or unknowingly, in the death of Gregory Haversham, and now Miss Marple was ready to unravel it all. "Let's begin, then," Miss Marple said calmly, her voice carrying over the quiet evening air. "I have gathered the final pieces of the puzzle, and it's time that we put them all together." Clara shifted uncomfortably, but Miss Marple ignored her discomfort. "Mrs. Penhallow," she began, turning to the woman who had confessed to knowing far more than she had initially let on. "You knew Gregory Haversham was a man of influence in this village, but it was more than just land deals, wasn't it? It was his threats, his manipulation of those around him, that caused you to take action." Mrs. Penhallow nodded, her eyes downcast. "Yes," she whispered. "Gregory was ruthless. He wanted to buy up the land of the elderly, and when he was refused, he threatened to ruin them, destroy their livelihoods. He had already taken advantage of Mrs. Crawley's poor health, and I knew he'd do the same to others. But when he started pushing my friends, the Bennets, into a corner, I couldn't stand by and watch it happen. I knew I had to stop him." Miss Marple glanced at Mrs. Bennet, noting the tightness in her posture. The woman had been quiet throughout, but Miss Marple knew she had more to say. "Mrs. Bennet," Miss Marple continued, "you and your daughter were among those who resisted Gregory's advances, weren't you? But it wasn't just about the land, was it? It was more personal. Gregory had something on you, didn't he?" Mrs. Bennet's eyes flickered to Clara, her lips trembling slightly. He threatened to expose us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He knew things about us, things we could never afford to have anyone else discover. He said that if we didn't sell the land, he'd ruin us." Clara's face was pale, and her hands twisted nervously in front of her. "We didn't have a choice," she murmured, her voice breaking. "He was going to destroy everything we had. We didn't know what to do." Miss Marple looked between the two women, understanding the weight of their confession. "And so, you were trapped, weren't you? Gregory had you by the throat, holding you both in a vice grip. But Mrs. Penhallow couldn't let him destroy you. She saw what he was capable of, and she decided to take matters into her own hands." Mrs. Penhallow's eyes were brimming with tears now, but she held herself together. "I couldn't let Gregory destroy everything. He was dangerous, and I knew I had to act before it was too late. I knew that if I didn't stop him, someone else would. So I did what I had to do." Miss Marple allowed a brief silence to fill the space between them. The truth had been laid bare, but there was still more to reveal. "And Evelyn," Miss Marple said, her voice sharp now. "Evelyn Birch. She was the one who found the body. But she wasn't just an innocent bystander, was she? She was part of it all." At the mention of Evelyn's name, the air seemed to grow heavier. Mrs. Penhallow looked down, clearly unwilling to meet Miss Marple's gaze. Mrs. Bennet's hands tightened, and Clara shifted uneasily on her feet. "It wasn't just a coincidence, was it?" Miss Marple pressed. Evelyn found Gregory's body in the garden. But what if I told you that she was the one who had arranged for him to be there? Clara's face paled, and Mrs. Bennet's lips trembled, but it was Mrs. Penhallow who spoke next. Evelyn. She was in on it. She knew what we were planning. She offered to help, to make sure everything went according to plan. Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Penhallow. So Evelyn was the one who helped you orchestrate it all. She knew that by discovering the body, she would draw everyone's attention to her. It would be the perfect alibi. Exactly, Mrs. Penhallow said, her voice filled with regret. Evelyn was eager to be involved. She wanted to be the one to take control of the situation, but I had no idea she'd take it so far. Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward the empty space, where Evelyn should have been standing. Where is Evelyn now? She asked quietly. Just as the words left her lips, the sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, and a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Evelyn, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with fear. She stopped a few feet away from the others, her gaze darting nervously between them. I knew you would figure it out, Evelyn said, her voice tinged with resignation. I didn't want to do it, but I couldn't let you all fail. I had to be part of it. I had to make sure it went perfectly. You knew all along, Miss Marple said softly but firmly. You knew that the only way to ensure Gregory's death looked like an accident was for you to be the one to find the body. You played your part perfectly, but now the truth has caught up with you. Evelyn swallowed hard, her body trembling. I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. I only wanted to stop Gregory. He had destroyed so many lives. I thought if I could just draw attention to myself, if I could just get the others to see, it would all be over. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but there was no pity in it. And now, it is over. You've all been part of the same tangled web of lies, and the truth has finally come to light. The silence stretched for a long moment before Miss Marple spoke again. But the real question, Evelyn, is this. Who truly had the motive to kill Gregory Haversham? Was it Mrs. Penhallow trying to protect the Bennets? Was it you trying to cover your tracks? Or was it someone else entirely? Evelyn took a shaky breath, her face contorting as she prepared to speak the final truth. The evening air had grown colder, the last traces of sunlight fading behind the horizon as Miss Marple, the Bennets, Mrs. Penhallow, and Evelyn Birch stood in tense silence. It was the kind of quiet that settled in only when all other words had been exhausted. And yet the final piece of the puzzle remained elusive. The truth, though it had been inching closer with every passing day, still hovered just beyond their grasp. Evelyn Birch stood a few paces away, her trembling hands clasped tightly in front of her, her face drained of color. The confession she had yet to make, the one final revelation that would tie everything together, hung in the air like an unsaid prayer, waiting to be spoken. Miss Marple had been waiting for this moment, knowing all along that Evelyn would be the one to crack under the pressure. But she needed just a little more to understand the true extent of the mystery. Evelyn, Miss Marple said gently, her voice cutting through the thick silence. You've already admitted to playing a part in what happened to Gregory, but there's something more, isn't there? Something you haven't told us yet. Evelyn flinched, and for a brief moment her eyes darted toward Mrs. Penhallow, then quickly shifted away, her gaze settling on the ground at her feet. She looked as though she might break into tears at any moment, yet there was a certain steely resolve behind her glassy eyes. Miss Marple knew that once Evelyn spoke, the rest of the puzzle would fall into place. I didn't mean for things to go this far, Evelyn began, her voice barely above a whisper. I only wanted to stop him. Stop Gregory. Stop him? Miss Marple's voice remained calm, but there was an edge of steel beneath it. Stop him from what, Evelyn? Evelyn's shoulders sagged, as if the weight of the world had settled on them all at once. He was going to ruin everything. You don't know what he was capable of. He'd already threatened Mrs. Crawley, and he was moving on to others. I couldn't stand by and let him destroy this village. But I didn't realize how far he'd go. He was ruthless, and when I saw what he was doing to Mrs. Bennet and Clara, I panicked. I wanted to protect them. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. And so you took matters into your own hands. You planned the scene, the scream, the discovery of the body. You knew that if you found him, the attention would immediately turn to you. You could keep suspicion away from the real killer. Evelyn shook her head, her face contorting with the weight of the confession. No, that wasn't the plan. At least, not exactly. I didn't plan to kill him. I didn't think he'd be dead. I just wanted to scare him, to make him stop. But when I went to the garden and saw him lying there, I panicked. I screamed. I didn't know what to do. And then everything spiraled out of control. Miss Marple studied her carefully. So you didn't intend for Gregory to die, she mused. But he did. And it's clear now that there was someone else involved. Someone who knew what was going on. The village square was silent again, the air thick with unspoken words. Mrs. Penhallow and the Bennets had been listening intently, but neither had said a word. Miss Marple turned her gaze back to Evelyn. There's more, isn't there? Miss Marple said, her voice like a gentle prod. You know who killed him, Evelyn. It wasn't just you, was it? For a moment, Evelyn seemed to stiffen as though the question had struck her at her very core. She bit her lip, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. It wasn't supposed to happen, Evelyn said, her voice breaking. I didn't want anyone to die. But when Gregory came to the house to confront Clara and Mrs. Bennet, he was angry, so angry. I saw it. I saw what he was capable of. He grabbed Clara, and I saw Mrs. Bennet's face. She was terrified. That's when it happened. Mrs. Bennet did it. There it was, the final revelation. Miss Marple's eyes shifted quickly to Mrs. Bennet, who had remained silent throughout the entire exchange. Mrs. Bennet's face was unreadable, but Miss Marple saw the flicker of something far too small to be a mere moment of doubt or confusion. You're saying Mrs. Bennet killed Gregory? Miss Marple's voice was steady, her gaze sharp. But why? You didn't mention it before, Evelyn. Why are you telling me this now? Mrs. Bennet remained still, her hands clenched tightly in front of her. Her expression was rigid, but Miss Marple could see the small tremors running through her body. She was trying to hold it all together, but it was clear to Miss Marple now that the facade was beginning to crack. Evelyn nodded, her face pale. It was all supposed to be a warning. Mrs. Bennet didn't want to kill him. She just wanted him to leave. But when he grabbed Clara, when he threatened her, she snapped. She was terrified, and she just pushed him. Miss Marple stood still for a moment, processing the words, allowing them to settle in her mind. So Mrs. Bennet pushed Gregory into the garden, and he fell, hitting his head, Miss Marple said softly, piecing it together. That explains the blood and the way he was positioned. It wasn't an intentional death. It was a tragic accident, brought on by fear. Mrs. Bennet's face crumpled, and for the first time she allowed her tears to spill. I didn't mean it, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I just wanted him to stop. I didn't want him to hurt Clara. I never wanted him dead. Clara stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. We never wanted it to come to this, she said quietly. We never wanted to be involved in this. But he was destroying everything we held dear, and we didn't know how to stop him. Miss Marple nodded slowly, absorbing the emotions and revelations that hung heavy in the air. It had not been premeditated murder. It had been the result of fear and panic, an accident caused by a man who had pushed too far, too often, and too relentlessly. But what about the button? Miss Marple asked, her voice calm and measured. How do you explain that? It was found near the scene. The group fell silent, the weight of Miss Marple's question hanging in the air. Evelyn's eyes flickered, and Mrs. Penhallow glanced quickly at Mrs. Bennet. Miss Marple saw the subtle exchange, and it only confirmed her suspicions. The button, Mrs. Penhallow said quietly, her voice full of regret, wasn't meant to be left behind. But in the chaos of the moment when everything went wrong, I couldn't think straight. I must have knocked it off Gregory's coat when I helped move him. I should have been more careful, Mrs. Bennet added, her voice trembling with guilt. But at that point, all I could think about was getting him away from Clara. Miss Marple turned to them both, her expression understanding but resolute. "You didn't intend for Gregory to die, but in your attempts to protect your family, it happened. And Evelyn," Miss Marple continued, her gaze now turning to the woman who had found the body, "you did what you thought was necessary to divert suspicion. You screamed, you brought attention to yourself, but all the while, you were protecting the one person who needed it most." The truth was laid bare now. The complexity of Gregory Haversham's death was not in a grand scheme, but in the quiet moments of fear, the desperate need for survival, and the fragile thread of guilt that held everyone together. "You will have to answer for this," Miss Marple said softly, "but I believe that your actions were born out of desperation, not malice." The silence that followed was heavy, but it was not one of shame or accusation. It was the kind of silence that marks the end of a long, hard journey, a journey through lies, fear, and truth. The mystery had come to its conclusion, and for the first time in days, the village of St. Mary Mead could breathe again. The truth had been revealed, and with it, a fragile peace had been restored. The sun was setting on the small village of St. Mary Mead, casting long, golden shadows across the cobblestone streets. The air had grown cooler as evening descended, but the pervasive sense of tension that had filled the village for days seemed to have finally lifted. Miss Marple stood by the fountain in the village square, the final pieces of the puzzle she had so carefully pieced together settling in her mind. The storm of emotions, the guilt, the secrets, and the lies had all come to a close. Yet, as always, Miss Marple knew that the aftermath of such a tragedy would leave its own scars. It was a quiet evening, the kind that seemed almost unreal after the whirlwind of events. The village had returned to its familiar rhythms, but there was a marked difference in the way the people of St. Mary Mead moved. They carried with them the weight of the tragedy that had occurred in their midst, a death that had shaken the very foundations of their peaceful community. Miss Marple could sense it in the way the villagers interacted now. The whispers had turned into quiet nods. The casual conversations had taken on a subdued air. The confession that had unfolded before her in Mrs. Penhallow's garden was one that she would not soon forget. Mrs. Penhallow's remorse, Evelyn's terror, and Mrs. Bennet's guilt had all intertwined in a complicated, heartbreaking web. Yet, as Miss Marple had suspected, there was no malice in their actions, only fear and desperation, and a desire to protect what they held dear. With the truth revealed, the mystery of Gregory Haversham's death had reached its inevitable conclusion. But Miss Marple knew that the true impact of this tragedy would be felt in the days to come, as each person involved faced the consequences of their actions. Justice would be served, of course, but it would not erase the emotional scars that would linger in the village long after the legal proceedings had taken their course. As Miss Marple slowly walked toward Mrs. Penhallow's house that evening, she reflected on the events of the past week. The murder had been a shock to the village, but it had also brought to light the complexities of human nature, how far people could be pushed before they cracked, how the smallest of actions could spiral into a tragedy. She had seen it all before, in different forms, in different places. But every time it was the same. The darkness that lay hidden beneath the surface of everyday life, the secrets that people kept locked away, the things they would do to protect those they loved. Mrs. Penhallow was sitting quietly on the porch when Miss Marple arrived, her eyes distant as she gazed out at the quiet village. The weight of the past few days had clearly taken a toll on her, but Miss Marple could see the flicker of relief in her eyes. The truth had been set free, and while it would be a long time before the village could truly heal, there was a sense of closure that had begun to take root. "Good evening, Mrs. Penhallow," Miss Marple said gently, taking a seat beside her. "Good evening, Miss Marple," Mrs. Penhallow replied, her voice soft. "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done. You've brought the truth to light, and for that I'll be forever grateful." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes kind but observant. "It was not me who revealed the truth, Mrs. Penhallow. It was all of you. You, Evelyn, Mrs. Bennet, and Clara. The truth was already there, waiting to be discovered. I simply had to ask the right questions." Mrs. Penhallow nodded slowly, her expression filled with a mixture of regret and relief. "It's all so overwhelming. I never wanted it to go this far. I only wanted to protect those I care about. But now, I see the cost of my actions, and I don't know how to make it right." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "You acted out of fear, not malice. I understand that. But now you must face the consequences of what's been done. And so must Evelyn, Mrs. Bennet, and Clara. The path ahead will not be easy, but it is the only way forward." There was a long pause as the two women sat in silence, the quiet of the evening wrapping around them. The distant sound of birds, settling for the night, the rustling of leaves in the breeze. These sounds were the only interruptions to the stillness that had settled over St. Mary Mead. After a moment, Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle but firm. "It is always hardest to face the truth after something like this. But it is necessary. Only by accepting what has happened can we begin to move on. And that, Mrs. Penhallow, is what I hope you will do now. Move forward, with the knowledge that you did what you thought was right, even if the consequences were more than you expected." Mrs. Penhallow sighed, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of the world had been lifted from them. "I don't know how I'll face the others," she said quietly. "How do you live with something like this?" "You live by acknowledging it, Mrs. Penhallow," Miss Marple replied softly, "and you live by making amends where you can. It will take time, but you will find your way." As the evening grew darker, Mrs. Penhallow stood, her movements slow but steady. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I'm not sure I can ever repay you for what you've done, but I will try to live with the knowledge that the truth is finally out, for the sake of the village and for the sake of the people I've hurt." Miss Marple stood as well, offering a smile that was both reassuring and knowing. "The truth always comes to light in the end, Mrs. Penhallow. It's just a matter of patience. And now, you can begin the process of healing." The two women shared a quiet moment, the soft rustling of leaves the only sound between them. It was clear to Miss Marple that Mrs. Penhallow, though burdened by guilt, had taken the first step toward redemption. The same could be said for Mrs. Bennet and Clara. Though they had been part of the tragedy, they too had the chance to begin anew. As Miss Marple walked back toward the village square, her thoughts turned to the other residents of St. Mary Mead. There would be more conversations, more truths revealed in the coming days. But for now, the village could rest, knowing that the mystery of Gregory Haversham's death had been solved. The lessons of fear, guilt, and redemption had been learned, and the people of St. Mary Mead would slowly, in their own way, move forward. And as for Miss Marple, she knew that there would always be more mysteries to unravel, more lives to understand, and more truths to uncover. But for tonight, as she watched the last traces of daylight fade into the evening, she felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The mystery was over, the village was at peace, and Miss Marple could rest, knowing she had done what she did best, revealed the truth and set the stage for the healing that would follow. The puzzle had been solved. And with it, the village could finally breathe again. The days following Gregory Haversham's death and the unraveling of the mystery were quieter than any Miss Marple could recall in St. Mary Mead. The fog had finally cleared, both literally and metaphorically, leaving behind a clearer view of the village's true nature. And yet, despite the clarity of the truth that had come to light, the villagers still carried with them a subtle tension, a shadow of guilt and regret that would take time to dissolve. Miss Marple had taken a few quiet days to herself, reflecting on the case and the lives that had been impacted by the events surrounding Gregory's untimely death. She had always believed that people were not simply the sum of their actions, but rather the sum of their choices, their fears, and their motivations. Gregory's death, after all, had not been caused by a single person's malice, but by a series of small decisions, each one leading to a tragic conclusion. Mrs. Penhallow had spent much of the last few days in deep contemplation. She had spent time with Mrs. Bennet and Clara, and though their conversations were difficult, they were moving toward healing. Clara, too, had shown remarkable growth. The young woman who had once been shy and unsure now carried herself with quiet strength, having faced the truth about the events of that fateful afternoon. There was still much to be done, apologies to be made, relationships to be rebuilt. But the first steps had been taken, and that Miss Marple knew was the hardest part. It was the quiet acceptance of one's actions that allowed for true healing to begin. One afternoon, a week after the truth had come to light, Miss Marple decided to take a walk through the village once more. It was a beautiful day, sunlight streaming through the trees, the air fresh and clear. She walked slowly, her thoughts reflecting on the journey the village had taken, from the idyllic days before Gregory's death to the revelations that had turned their world upside down. The village, though forever changed, had begun to heal. As Miss Marple passed by the familiar sights, the old church with its ivy-covered walls, the market square where children played, she found herself reflecting on how often people underestimated the complexity of their own lives. Villagers like Mrs. Penhallow, Mrs. Bennet, and Evelyn Birch had lived among their secrets for so long, thinking they could keep them hidden, not realizing how fragile the balance they had created was. It was only when forced to confront their actions that they truly understood the weight they had carried for so long. The village square was empty except for a few scattered villagers going about their daily business. As Miss Marple walked past the bakery, she spotted a familiar face. Clara sitting on a bench near the fountain, her hands folded in her lap as she stared out across the square. Her expression was distant, as though lost in thought, and Miss Marple paused for a moment, observing her quietly. She had always had a keen sense of when to speak and when to remain silent, and today, Miss Marple chose the latter. Clara looked up as she heard Miss Marple approach. Her face softened with a smile, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "Miss Marple," Clara said softly, her voice carrying a sense of calmness that was new, yet deeply reassuring. "It's good to see you. Good to see you." Miss Marple smiled back, taking a seat beside Clara on the bench. "And you, my dear, how are you today?" Clara's gaze shifted to the fountain, the water gently rippling in the late afternoon sun. "I'm all right. I've been thinking about everything. What happened, what we've all been through. It's strange, you know. I never imagined it would come to this." "None of us did, Clara," Miss Marple said quietly. "But life has a way of revealing truths when we least expect them." Clara nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't know how to move forward, Miss Marple. It feels like everything has changed, like nothing will ever be the same." Miss Marple studied her for a long moment, taking in the vulnerability in Clara's voice and the way her hands clutched the fabric of her dress. The young woman was still processing the weight of everything that had happened, the fear, the guilt, the relief. She had seen too much, too quickly, and Miss Marple understood the depth of her emotions. "Sometimes, Clara," Miss Marple said softly, "it's the hardest moments that teach us the most." The tragedy of Gregory's death has forced many of us to confront parts of ourselves we'd rather leave hidden. But in that confrontation lies the opportunity for growth, for healing. Clara's lips trembled as she looked at Miss Marple, her voice almost a whisper. "But what if it's too late? What if everything we've done is too much to forgive?" Miss Marple's gaze softened, and she placed a hand gently on Clara's. "You see, my dear, forgiveness is not something others give us. It's something we give to ourselves. To forgive truly is to accept our own imperfections and learn from them. It's not about forgetting, but about understanding and moving forward." Clara looked at Miss Marple, her brow furrowed in thought. "You make it sound so simple. But how do you move forward when the past is so heavy?" Miss Marple smiled gently, the lines of age in her face softening. "It's not always simple, dear, but it is necessary. We cannot change the past, but we can shape our future by how we face it. All of you, Mrs. Bennet, Mrs. Penhallow, and even Evelyn, have a chance now to make things right. But it starts with acceptance. The first step is always the hardest." Clara nodded slowly, her eyes turning back to the fountain. "I think I understand. It's hard to know where to start." "That's understandable," Miss Marple said with a slight chuckle. "The path forward can be unclear, especially after a storm like this. But you are not alone, Clara. You have the support of the people around you, your family, your friends, and you have the strength within you to find your way." Clara sat quietly for a long time, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the edge of the bench. Miss Marple, ever patient, waited in silence, allowing Clara the space she needed. Finally, Clara spoke again, her voice steady and thoughtful. "I want to be better," she said quietly. "I want to make things right." Miss Marple smiled warmly. "And you will, Clara. You already have taken the most important step. Now it's time to keep moving forward." The two women sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching as the last traces of sunlight faded from the sky. The village square, once filled with uncertainty and fear, was now peaceful again. The fountain's gentle splashing was the only sound that filled the air, and in that moment, everything seemed still and calm. As the evening deepened and the last light of day slipped into dusk, Miss Marple stood, her movements slow and deliberate. "I must be off now, Clara," Miss Marple said, her voice full of warmth. "But remember, my dear, that every day is an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to make amends. Don't let the past weigh you down. You have the power to shape your future." Clara stood as well, her face brightening with a renewed sense of hope. "Thank you, Miss Marple. You've helped me more than I can say." Miss Marple gave her a gentle nod. "It's not me who's done the hard work, Clara. You've taken the first step toward healing, and that, my dear, is all anyone can ask." As Miss Marple walked away, she glanced back toward the village square where Clara remained, her figure now illuminated by the soft glow of the streetlights. There was something in the way Clara stood, her posture straighter, her head held higher. It was as though the weight of her burdens had shifted just a little in the right direction. Miss Marple continued her walk, her thoughts drifting to the others in the village. The road to healing would be long for them all, but the truth had been revealed, and the first steps had been taken, and that in itself was a victory. The puzzle had been solved, the lessons learned, and the village of St. Mary Mead, though forever changed, could now move forward, one step at a time. The autumn air had settled in over St. Mary Mead, and with it came the quiet hum of change. The village, which had been torn apart by the events surrounding Gregory Haversham's death, was beginning to heal. The wounds were still raw, of course, but as Miss Marple walked through the streets, she could see the subtle shift in the way the villagers interacted with one another. There was a new awareness in the air, a new understanding that not everything was as it seemed, that the layers of human nature could be far more complex than the surface might suggest. Miss Marple had spent the last few days meeting with the key players in the mystery, giving them the space they needed to reflect on their actions and the choices they had made. Mrs. Penhallow, having faced the consequences of her decisions, was beginning to rebuild her life, albeit slowly. She had started visiting Mrs. Crawley more frequently, making amends for her earlier mistakes, and her grief had slowly turned into a determination to make things right. It was a humbling process for her, but Miss Marple could see the sincerity in her efforts. Clara, too, was adjusting to the new reality of her life. The weight of her guilt was still there, of course, but she was no longer as burdened by it as she once had been. Clara had started helping Mrs. Bennet with some of the household chores, and she had begun visiting the elderly in the village, those who had been impacted by Gregory's land dealings. It was her way of giving back, of making amends for her part in the tragedy. And then there was Mrs. Bennet. She had remained mostly silent in the days after the truth had been revealed, but Miss Marple had noticed the subtle shifts in her demeanor. There was no longer a hardness in her gaze, no longer the sharpness that had defined her in the past. Mrs. Bennet had started to reach out to the other villagers, offering help where she could, and her conversations with Clara had grown warmer, less strained. Evelyn Birch, however, had been the most difficult to track down. She had disappeared from the village after the truth had come to light, avoiding the conversations and the inevitable confrontation with those she had wronged. It was understandable, of course. Evelyn had always been the type to react emotionally, to wear her heart on her sleeve. She had never been able to fully accept the consequences of her actions. But Miss Marple knew that she would eventually return. People always did. On this particular day, Miss Marple was walking to the village square when she noticed Clara sitting on a bench near the fountain. Clara was alone, her hands folded in her lap as she gazed out at the bustling street. There was a quiet resolve in her posture that Miss Marple couldn't help but notice. The young woman had come a long way in the past few weeks, but there was still more to be done. "Good afternoon, Clara," Miss Marple said gently, her voice filled with warmth. Clara looked up, a small smile tugging at her lips. Good afternoon, Miss Marple. I wasn't expecting to see you today. Miss Marple took a seat beside her, her gaze drifting to the fountain as well. I've been making my rounds, as it were. It's a good day to walk, isn't it? Clara nodded, her eyes softening as she looked at the steady flow of water. Yes, it is. I've been thinking a lot, about everything that's happened, about Gregory. Miss Marple turned to her, her expression kind but knowing. It's never easy, Clara. The hardest part is not in facing the truth, but in accepting it, and accepting that things cannot be undone. Clara's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she did not look away. I don't think I'll ever be able to forgive myself. I know I wasn't the one who killed him, but I still feel responsible. We all contributed to his death in one way or another. Miss Marple placed a hand gently on Clara's arm. You're not alone in that feeling, my dear, and you don't have to carry that burden alone either. It's not easy to come to terms with our mistakes, but that's part of the process. The important thing is that you've recognized it, and that you're doing something to make amends. Clara looked down at her hands, taking a slow breath. I've been trying. I've been visiting the elderly in the village, helping out wherever I can. I want to make things right, Miss Marple. I don't want to feel like this forever. I think you're already on the right path, Miss Marple said, smiling kindly. It's the small steps, the consistent efforts that make the difference. And you'll find that as you help others, you'll find peace for yourself as well. Clara's smile grew, the faintest trace of hope returning to her eyes. I hope so. Miss Marple stood, brushing a small speck of dirt from her coat. I must be on my way, Clara. There are still a few things left to do, but I'll be keeping an eye on you as always. Clara laughed softly, a more genuine sound than Miss Marple had heard in weeks. I'll do my best, Miss Marple. Miss Marple. As Miss Marple walked away, she couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The puzzle had been solved, the truth revealed, but it was the healing process that would take time. The villagers were learning how to rebuild their lives, piece by piece, just as they had to rebuild their trust in one another. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but it was happening. As she passed by the market square, Miss Marple spotted Mrs. Penhallow speaking with a small group of villagers. Her body language was open, her hands expressive as she explained something to them. It was clear that she had taken Miss Marple's words to heart, and now she was finding her way back into the fold of the village. She had become a part of the healing process, one of the first to offer her apologies and take responsibility for her actions. Miss Marple smiled to herself. Mrs. Penhallow had always been a strong character, but now she was beginning to understand the importance of vulnerability, of owning her mistakes. The woman was learning the lessons that life had forced upon her, and she would emerge stronger for it. As Miss Marple walked down the quiet road, she reflected on the strange, winding path that had led them all to this point. Gregory Haversham's death had been a catalyst for change, not just for the Bennets, Mrs. Penhallow, and Evelyn, but for the entire village. The shadow of his presence had lingered for too long, but now that shadow had been lifted, and the village was free to begin anew. There was still work to be done, of course. There always would be. But Miss Marple had seen enough to know that the village would heal. The cracks, though deep, would fill with new understanding, new relationships, and new beginnings. As she reached her home and stepped inside, Miss Marple felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. The case was closed, but the lessons it had imparted would live on in the hearts of those who had been part of it. The mystery had been solved, the truth revealed, and now it was time for the village to move forward, step by step, into the light. She sat by the fire, her thoughts calm, her heart at peace. St. Mary Mead was a small village, but like all places, it was filled with complexities and contradictions. And Miss Marple, as always, had been there to unravel them, one truth at a time. The lemon tart was long gone, but the lessons it had taught would remain for years to come. And with that thought, Miss Marple closed her eyes and allowed herself the quiet rest that she had so thoroughly earned. The village of St. Mary Mead was bathed in the soft light of early morning, a light that carried with it a sense of quiet, renewal. It had been several weeks since the resolution of Gregory Haversham's tragic death, and the village had slowly begun to return to a semblance of normalcy. The wounds had not completely healed, but they had been acknowledged, and in their acknowledgement lay the path to recovery. The truth had been revealed. The guilty had faced their actions, and for the most part, the residents of the village had found a way to move forward. Miss Marple had taken a step back from her usual activities, allowing the village to settle into its new rhythm. The mystery in her mind was solved. The remaining task was to watch the healing process unfold, quietly observing as the people of St. Mary Mead took the lessons learned from their mistakes and worked toward redemption. It was not an easy task, and not all of them would succeed. But Miss Marple had faith that time would smooth the edges of the most painful memories. She had spent the morning visiting Mrs. Crawley, a sweet, elderly woman who had been one of Gregory Haversham's earlier victims. Mrs. Crawley had been one of the elderly residents targeted by Gregory in his push to buy up village land at prices well below market value. The woman had been frail, struggling with health problems, and had been too intimidated to refuse Gregory's offer. Mrs. Crawley had never quite understood the complexity of the land deal, but had trusted Miss Marple to help her through it. That trust had been well placed, and Mrs. Crawley had found solace in knowing that, despite Gregory's threats, she had done nothing wrong. The villagers who had been exploited had begun to feel a sense of justice, and the sting of fear was slowly beginning to fade. Miss Marple was on her way to Mrs. Penhallow's house for their usual afternoon tea when she spotted Clara walking through the village square, a bundle of fresh flowers in her arms. Clara had been spending much of her time visiting the elderly, trying to make amends for the role she had played in Gregory's death. Though the guilt had not completely disappeared from Clara's heart, Miss Marple could see the young woman was trying her best to move forward, to make a positive impact on the village that had once felt so distant to her. "Clara," Miss Marple called, smiling as the young woman stopped in her tracks. "You're looking well today." Clara's face brightened at the sight of Miss Marple. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect to see you here. I was just picking these for Mrs. Crawley. She asked if I could bring her some flowers. It's the least I can do." Miss Marple chuckled softly, her gaze warm. "You've certainly been keeping yourself busy, and it's good to see you so. Full of purpose, Clara. It's a wonderful thing to be able to turn one's focus to helping others after a difficult time. It's the first step toward finding peace with yourself." Clara lowered her gaze for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "I never thought I could do anything like this. I was always so focused on myself, on my own problems. But now, helping others feels like the only thing that makes sense. I can't undo what's happened, but maybe I can make some small difference." "You've already made a great difference, Clara," Miss Marple said kindly, her voice filled with quiet approval. "You've shown that the hardest thing of all is admitting when we've made mistakes, but once we do that, we can start to make things right." Clara smiled faintly, a sense of peace settling over her. "I just hope that what I'm doing is enough, that I'm doing the right thing." "There's no such thing as enough," Miss Marple said softly. "There is only the path we choose to take, and it's in walking that path with sincerity and kindness that we find the healing we need. You're doing just that, Clara, and that's all anyone can ask." Clara gave a quiet nod, the weight of Miss Marple's words settling on her like a gentle reassurance. She turned toward Mrs. Crawley's house, her steps lighter now, as if the burden she had carried for so long was finally starting to lift. Miss Marple watched her for a moment before continuing on her way to Mrs. Penhallow's house. As she walked, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. The case of Gregory Haversham had been complex, full of hidden motives and tangled emotions. But the one thing that had become clear was that it was not malice or cruelty that had led to Gregory's death, but fear. Fear of losing everything, fear of being exposed, fear of the unknown. And in the end, it was that fear that had driven people to make choices that they would regret for the rest of their lives. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky by the time Miss Marple arrived at Mrs. Penhallow's house. The windows were open, allowing the warm evening breeze to flow through the rooms. Mrs. Penhallow was seated at her kitchen table, a tray of teacups in front of her, and a small vase of fresh flowers on the windowsill. "Ah, Miss Marple, how lovely to see you," Mrs. Penhallow said, standing as Miss Marple entered the room. "Please, come in. I've just made some tea, and I thought we might have a quiet chat." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes softening at the warmth in Mrs. Penhallow's voice. "I'd be delighted, Mrs. Penhallow. I'm happy to see you so well." The two women sat down at the table, and Miss Marple took a moment to observe Mrs. Penhallow. The older woman had certainly gone through a great deal over the past few weeks, but Miss Marple saw now that she was beginning to regain her strength. There was a certain lightness in her manner, a sense of calm that had not been there before. Mrs. Penhallow had begun to make peace with the choices she had made, and that, Miss Marple knew, was the hardest part of the process. "I've been meaning to ask you, Miss Marple," Mrs. Penhallow said after a long sip of tea, her voice thoughtful. "How do you manage to stay so calm in the face of all the drama, the emotion? You always seem so composed." Miss Marple smiled warmly, her eyes twinkling. "Ah, well, Mrs. Penhallow, I've learned over the years that the most important thing we can do is listen. Not just with our ears, but with our hearts. People often carry so much inside of them, and sometimes all they need is someone who will quietly listen without judgment." Mrs. Penhallow nodded slowly, taking in the wisdom of Miss Marple's words. "I think I've spent most of my life being afraid of people's judgments. I've been so concerned with what others thought of me that I never stopped to listen to my own heart." "It's a difficult thing to do," Miss Marple said gently. "But once you start listening, truly listening, the answers become clearer." The two women sat in comfortable silence, sipping their tea as the evening sun cast a golden glow over the room. Miss Marple knew that Mrs. Penhallow, like many others in the village, had been carrying a heavy burden. But now she was finding a way to lighten that load, to take responsibility for her actions and move forward. It wasn't easy and it wasn't quick, but it was real. And it was the first step toward healing. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, Miss Marple," Mrs. Penhallow said quietly, breaking the silence. "About making amends, about facing our fears. I think I'm ready to do that. To make things right." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "I believe you are, Mrs. Penhallow, and I think you'll find that when you face your fears and admit your mistakes, the weight of them becomes a little lighter." The evening continued on, with the two women discussing the changes that had come to the village, the lessons they had all learned, and the road ahead. It was a quiet conversation, one filled with the kind of wisdom that only comes after facing the darkest moments of life. As Miss Marple left Mrs. Penhallow's house that evening, she felt a deep sense of contentment. The mystery had been solved, the truth had been revealed, and the people of St. Mary Mead were on their way to healing. There would be more challenges ahead, of course. Life was never without its struggles, but Miss Marple knew that the village was stronger now, united by the lessons they had learned, and with the wisdom to face whatever came next. The mystery of Gregory Haversham's death had come to a quiet resolution, and with it, the village could finally begin again. The winds of change that had swept through St. Mary Mead in the weeks following Gregory Haversham's death had begun to settle. The village, still bearing the marks of the tragedy, was slowly finding its balance again. Mrs. Penhallow was becoming a familiar face at village events once more, her sincerity in making amends not unnoticed by those she had once alienated. Clara, too, had found her place, her quiet yet determined efforts to rebuild trust in herself and the village growing stronger with each passing day. Even Mrs. Bennet, though still reserved, was seen more often helping with the village's affairs, taking on small tasks that had once seemed far beyond her reach. Despite this newfound peace, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that the village, though healing, still held secrets yet to be fully revealed. There was an uneasiness lingering in the air, an unspoken tension that she couldn't quite place. The truth of Gregory Haversham's death had been laid bare, but as Miss Marple walked the streets of St. Mary Mead, she sensed that the final curtain on this mystery had yet to fall. There was still something unfinished about it all. The most recent conversation she'd had with Clara lingered in her thoughts. The young woman, though eager to move forward, had admitted to Miss Marple that a part of her still felt haunted by the past. She had worked tirelessly to help others, to right the wrongs she had committed, but Clara's underlying discomfort, her fear that something might remain unresolved, had struck Miss Marple as something she needed to pay attention to. Perhaps there was more to this mystery than what had initially appeared. Perhaps some small part of it had been overlooked, just waiting to be discovered. Miss Marple had always trusted her instincts, and today, as she walked toward Mrs. Penhallow's house for their usual afternoon tea, something about the village square felt different. The air was thick, not with the usual bustle of the villagers, but with a subtle tension that seemed to be growing with each step. The sounds of children playing in the square had stopped. The shops, which had once been full of activity, seemed quieter. Even the birds that usually filled the trees with song had grown eerily silent. Arriving at Mrs. Penhallow's house, Miss Marple was greeted warmly, but she could see that Mrs. Penhallow had noticed the change in the atmosphere as well. "Miss Marple, how lovely to see you," Mrs. Penhallow said as she opened the door. "I was just thinking about our last conversation. How is everything going in the village?" Miss Marple smiled, stepping inside and settling into her usual chair by the fire. "It seems the village is finally starting to find its balance, Mrs. Penhallow. People are beginning to heal, and there's a quieter sense of peace now." Mrs. Penhallow nodded, but there was a hint of something else in her eyes. A restlessness, perhaps, or a lingering worry that refused to dissipate. "That's good to hear, but I can't shake the feeling that something is still off. Something in the air, as though the village isn't fully at peace yet." Miss Marple studied Mrs. Penhallow carefully. "You're not the only one who's felt that way. I've sensed it myself, though I can't quite put my finger on it. The village may have moved on, but there's a tension that lingers in the corners." Mrs. Penhallow's gaze grew distant, and she sighed, a heaviness settling over her features. "I think I know what you mean. I've been thinking about it too, especially about what Clara said. She's been working so hard to make things right, to rebuild what was broken. But I don't know if she's really found peace with herself. She keeps asking me if it's enough, if what she's doing can truly undo the past." Miss Marple looked thoughtfully at Mrs. Penhallow, her voice soft. "It's never really enough, you know. The past has a way of lingering, of coloring the way we see the present. But Clara is doing something important. She's giving of herself, trying to make amends. That's the most anyone can do." "I know," Mrs. Penhallow murmured. "But it's still hard to let go, isn't it? Even with the truth out there, even with everything revealed. We still carry the weight of what we did, what we allowed to happen. It's not easy to forgive ourselves." Miss Marple nodded slowly, understanding more than Mrs. Penhallow could know. Forgiveness is one of the most difficult things to give, especially when it's for ourselves. But without it, there's no true healing. For a moment, the two women sat in silence, the crackling of the fire filling the space between them. Miss Marple could feel the weight of the conversation, and as always, she knew that the resolution to this mystery, this strange, painful chapter in St. Mary Mead's history, was not in the truth alone. It was in the understanding, the forgiveness, and the quiet work of moving forward. Just then, a knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Mrs. Penhallow glanced up, clearly surprised. "I wasn't expecting anyone. I'll get it." Miss Marple stood as well, her instincts flaring. "Let me answer that," she said quietly. "I suspect it may be someone with more to say." When she opened the door, she was surprised to see Clara standing there, her expression anxious, her hands wringing the hem of her coat. The young woman looked up at Miss Marple with a mix of guilt and determination in her eyes. "Miss Marple, I need to talk to you," Clara said, her voice trembling slightly. "There's something I've been thinking about, something I didn't say before." Mrs. Penhallow, sensing the gravity of the moment, stepped forward. "Clara, what's wrong? You're not looking well?" Clara shook her head, taking a deep breath. "It's not that. It's about Evelyn. I've been thinking about what happened with her, about how I never really asked her why she did what she did. I know she was involved. I know she helped me and my mother, but I never really asked her why." Miss Marple's heart quickened as Clara's words sunk in. Evelyn Birch had always been a key figure in the story, a woman whose motivations had remained murky. She had been the one to draw attention to herself at the scene of the crime, but had she truly been as innocent as she had appeared? Or was there more to her role in Gregory Haversham's death than Miss Marple had assumed? "Why didn't you speak to her sooner?" Miss Marple asked gently, her mind racing with possibilities. Clara hesitated, looking guilty. "I suppose I was too scared to. Too ashamed. I never really understood Evelyn. She was so eager to please. So dramatic. I thought I understood her. thought I could control what she did. But now I realize I was wrong. Miss Marple watched Clara closely, her voice soft but probing. And now you feel you need to know the whole truth, to understand Evelyn's role in everything that happened. Clara nodded, her eyes filling with tears. Yes. I need to understand why she did what she did. Because I think she's been carrying something she hasn't told me. And if I don't know, I can't move forward. Mrs. Penhallow looked at Miss Marple, her concern etched in her expression. Do you think Evelyn will talk now? Miss Marple's gaze was steady, filled with quiet determination. Evelyn has been hiding something, and perhaps now it is time for her to reveal it. After everything that's happened, there's only one way for this village to fully heal, and that is for every truth to be known. With that, Miss Marple turned toward the door, knowing the next step would be the final one, the last piece of the puzzle that had eluded her. It was time to face Evelyn, to ask the questions that had lingered for too long. And in doing so, she knew that the village of St. Mary Mead would finally find its closure.